All right. Welcome, everybody, to a fireside chat about Microsoft's nonprofit investments that we think that you should understand. I'm Kyle Haines, and I'm joined today by Ryan Ozimek. The goal for today is to just keep this really informal. Ryan and I have known each other for a number of years. We were talking last week and we thought, man, this would be great if we could find a way to just have an informal conversation, let people ask questions, and then we realized we needed to create a little more structure. So hopefully today we can have a structured conversation, share our perspective while keeping it informal, and let people ask questions along the way. But before I get started, Ryan, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. This is Ryan Ozimek over at PicNet and Soapbox Engage. Awesome to be here. Also, I guess it's okay to have Kyle on as well too. No, Kyle, it's awesome to get a chance to connect here. There's been so much going on in the world, so much going on in the US here, so much going on in the technology nonprofit space that I'm excited to chat it up. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So fortunately for everyone, we don't have many slides. We're going to just go, as soon as we're done with this slide, you're going to get to see both Ryan and I ready for our fireside chat. But some quick housekeeping. The first is if you have a question, you can use the chat feature in the webinar. The hope is we have enough time to answer some of the questions at the end of it. But I have given the caveat already that both Ryan and I love to talk. So hopefully we leave time for everyone else to interject their ideas and questions. Secondly, we're going to send out a copy of today's recording after today's webinar. So feel free to share it with colleagues, family, as an early holiday holiday present, whoever you think would be interested in this topic. And with that, I'm going to jump right into our chat. Ryan, if you want to share your video, I'll do the same. And we'll see how good I am at Zoom webinars today.
Oh, it's chilly. It's chilly here in Nome, Alaska, Kyle. That's
Yeah.
where I'm at. Yep.
I
got penguins. I got penguins living with me here.
I got to tell you that I am not surprised in the least that you came in a costume. The best I could do was changing my virtual background, which I'm sure is it's not going to serve me well.
You're not in Switzerland? That's unfortunate. I just figured you're coming off the slopes.
No. Getting there shortly after today's chat. So Ryan, I thought I'd start with last year, you and I, we were at Dreamforce and you said this thing to me that I've been thinking about ever since then. You said, I feel like Microsoft is in a tunnel and they're about to come out of that tunnel and people are going to be like, whoa. And I guess, do you think Microsoft, where are they? Are they still in the tunnel? I know you've been learning more about them since Dreamforce. I'm curious what your perspective is.
Yeah, no, thanks. I as a little bit of a background, I remember this must have been about 2.5 years ago or so. I was at the nonprofit technology conference, the NTC. Remember, we used to go to places together and see other humans. So I was at the NTC in New Orleans a few years ago, and I remember a gentleman came on over to our Soapbox Engage booth, which was just full of these giant inflatable penguins over here, and was kind of chatting up with me. And I later learned that he was Eric Arnold over at Microsoft Tech for Social Impact. This is a few years ago, and I get a chance to stay in touch with Eric and learn a little bit more about what Microsoft Tech for Social Impact was, what it was looking to do, where it was heading. And I just thought, Microsoft is one of those, I don't know, it's like household nonprofit names. Like you've just heard about them everywhere. So many organizations are using Microsoft-based products. And I was thinking to myself, I wonder what Microsoft is up to. I wonder what it's looking to tackle. As I learned more about Tech for Social Impact, it was really intriguing to me to be thinking, is this going to be the type of thing that for many years, a lot of us knew what Microsoft is and what it's been doing and its work with TechSoup and others, and is it going to be this freight train just like hauling right through the middle of a tunnel in a mountain and coming out the other end, and the rest of us out here kind of living in your Switzerland space are just going to say, what just happened? Like, what is coming out of Redmond? And I'm feeling like that's what we've seen just in the last couple of weeks. Microsoft's been making some big announcements, been sharing some big news about what it's been up to, and it's yeah, I do feel as though there's been a lot of forward progress and movement coming out of the Microsoft space. And yeah, I think it was led a lot by the common data model, the CDM, which we can sure chat about as well too. But I think that you know, my personal experience in working with Microsoft over the years in the open source space led me to believe that what they could be doing in the nonprofit space around open source as well had a pretty big opportunity of being big and moving quick. So it's been interesting to see what's been happening. What do you think? What's been, you know, I shared that perspective with you. I was just wondering, what did you think about how things have been shaken out over the last few months or so?
You know, I love analogies, and I thought, like, I've been thinking and turning the analogy of a freight train over in my head ever since you came up with it. I think mostly I was upset that you came up with a really powerful analogy that I hadn't. And I think you hit on it earlier. I mean, so many nonprofits are already using Microsoft, even if they think of Microsoft as Excel. You know, it's when I think of a freight train, I think like that metaphor, just I thought about it a lot. They're really big. They can have a ton of different cars on them. There can be an oil car, there can be a grain car, there can be cars on the train car. And they can get a ton of momentum when they get going. And I think the question for me is, what is there truly momentum, and what does that momentum need to be sustainable momentum? And that leads me to the question that comes up for me, Ryan, is, you know, you've been a leader in a number of different nonprofit communities, and I know that you're an evangelist for the idea of open source and access to technology. I think you've been involved in the Joomla community since before it started. I don't know how old you are. You know, since the very beginning. I know you've been involved in the Salesforce community. Like, what do you see in a community like Microsoft's that might be similar to what you've seen at Joomla or what you've seen in the Salesforce community?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'm passionate about open source because I'm passionate about the mission of nonprofits, our focus on a more just society and a just world, and what we can do if we increase transparency, if we increase accountability, if we increase empowerment to individuals and to organizations. And I think for a long time, that has been something that's been tough for many small organizations to be able to get their hands wrapped around. I mean, to be able to have full access to your data, to be able to have access to your data in a way that it can be repurposed in different ways, to be able to have access to how your data is being managed, where it exists, what are easy ways to connect to it. I think that's been an ideal that many organizations have wished they could have. I think that open source is a sounds nice type of thing, but like we got to get the job done type of approach. And I'm very interested to see what's been happening. You know, in the Salesforce world, folks might not know this, but when I got involved in the Salesforce world back in 2005, 2006, I guess it was the very, very beginning of what people now know as the Nonprofit Success Pack. And I remember being in there early and saying, you know, I want to be involved in something that's open source that people can contribute to, can give back to the community, can recognize that the nonprofit space is wide and varied. There's not just one type of nonprofit. And tools need to be flexible, tools need to be affordable within the reach of organizations, and need to be able to expand. And I feel like what I saw in the early days of Joomla, which is a content management system, what I saw in the early days of the nonprofit starter pack or the nonprofit template for the old school folks on the call, what I'm seeing in the nonprofit success pack, and now what I'm seeing in the Microsoft world around the common data model, open standards, and an open initiative to bring together the community and have it be less just about a company and more about the community and standards, the more excited I am. And I don't think that things like the common data model need to necessarily be in the realm of one company. They don't need to be something that just like a Microsoft or a Salesforce or a Blackbaud manages, owns, and controls. I think we're moving into a new era where we've got open by default. If there was a way for us to then use that in a way that nonprofits could make the most of it and not feel like the technology is out of the reach, I think there's a lot of promise to it. So for me, I'm seeing a nice wave of memories from the Joomla world and then from the beginning of the Salesforce world. I'm starting to see that again in the Microsoft space. And I'm feeling like the world is moving in the right direction. I don't know what do you think, Kyle? Because you're seeing it from, a CIO perspective as well too. The work that you've been doing with the Lymphoma Research Foundation. Is this like boots on the ground? Is this making sense? Is it the type of thing that the average organization, mid-sized, larger organizations, is it going to be something that makes sense to where we're heading?
Total. I mean, it's interesting because that was when you said earlier that you saw this as just being an issue that affects small nonprofits. I actually think that it fits. It's an issue that affects all kinds of nonprofits, mid-size and large nonprofits. And I wondered whether we were going to talk about the common data model today, because when you and I get going, we start talking about all of these sort of, if you're in the ecosystem, and it's not different than Salesforce, but if you're in the ecosystem, you know what it means. But I think you hit on it earlier, this idea of a common data model, this idea that if we can get nonprofits, and more importantly, if we can get those who are building nonprofit solutions in the technology space to stop having discussions about how to structure data, how data should be collected, how it should be linked, and we can move instead into something more entrepreneurial, like actually building solutions, I think that's the emphasis that the community needs to be in. And I think of my work over the course of the last 25 years, so much has been around unifying how data is going to be tracked and doing ETLs or building integrations or testing out APIs. And again, the amount of time that we spend wrangling data, it can just be time better spent really
Right.
using technology to accelerate that social impact idea that you were talking about earlier. So I wondered whether we were talking about the common data model, but to me, that is without a lot of experience in open source, that's a way to get the idea of data outside of the control of an individual vendor and more in the control of a broader community.
Right. And I like to think about open source a lot as a gift giving community. So there's an organization that I happen to sit on the board of directors of called the Goat Farm Foundation. We put on events at least once a year. We meet on a regular basis to be talking about things like this. And I think any company organization that can really push towards allowing both developers and engineering inclined folks as well as the non-developers to get involved in the construction of the projects and the products that we're going to be using. That's just, I feel like this can be more critical than ever. And the way in which this can be done through open standards that allow us as organizations to be able to pivot and move as needed, I think is really important. So let it be the Salesforce world, let it be the Microsoft world, whatever ecosystem that might be from a corporate perspective. I know that there's been many attempts at trying to create something like a common data model, and some of them already exist. I think what we're seeing with the common data model that's really picked up steam in the Microsoft community is the ability to be able to leverage that and to let companies be able to develop solutions for volunteering, grant management, fundraising, all across the board, means that it's going to be a lot easier for tool makers to be able to focus on like what are the tools that folks need, and less about let's start from scratch and hope that everything works together.
I was at the Blackbaud conference. I think it wasn't this past year, it was 2 years ago. And I don't remember whether it was Microsoft or whether it was Blackbaud. They talked about this idea of citizen developers. And what I like is this idea that how do you create an ecosystem where citizen developers and actually vendors who are developers, how can they interface and not have to struggle with the idea of data normalization or how is the data going to be structured? And I think that this idea of citizen developers allow people to build iterative, minimally viable products and then move up to solutions like Soapbox Engage, or move up to solutions like ones from Blackbaud. And so that's what I love about the common data model. And I think, we haven't talked about it yet, but some of the work of Microsoft in terms of nurturing an environment of citizen developers, not just developers, people who have an idea, who want to build an app and don't have any coding experience.
Well, I think one of the things that always has concerned me about talking about citizen developers is that from a product or engineering perspective, I keep thinking, oh my goodness, here comes like the next 5 shadow apps, because they're not the real apps. It's like something that a small team has made off in the shadows over here. It's not going to work with the rest of everything else. It's not following the data principles and the data model we've spent so much time building as an institution. So I've always been concerned about that. And with platforms that are out there from the Microsoft space, Salesforce space, everywhere, it's becoming more accessible for these citizen developers to like start to build the end mini tools that they need, or apps, to get the job done. My hope is that things like the common data model are going to make it such that great citizen developers, don't worry about building shadow systems. You can actually leverage the same data that we're using as an institution and be able to tap into that, but have an entirely different user experience. Have a very purpose-driven app that does one specific thing really, really well, but taps into the existing data model you've got there. So, in the Microsoft space, I've been learning more and more about the Common Data Service, the CDS, like just this concept of just there being a layer of data that lies beneath everything that your organization could build in the Microsoft ecosystem. Like, that's interesting. that's pretty appealing. I've heard you talking about this as well too. And I'm just thinking that if you've got that plus a common data model to be able to leverage on top of, then you could build those small purpose-built solutions without needing to worry about building another contacts object or another grant object that you can probably repurpose and use what you've already got.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, you talked about my role at Lymphoma Research Foundation, or the role of a CIO. It almost puts a greater emphasis in some ways on governance, right? It's almost like, okay, I'm going to empower citizen developers. I'm going to empower all kinds of a different type of user, but the governance piece is it's got to align to the common data model. I don't care. You can build it in whatever, you could build it in Salesforce, but it's got to align to the common data model. And I think you hit on it early on. I have to remind myself that the common data model, the aspirations for it, at least as I understand it, is it's not a Microsoft thing. It's a thing, right? Of which Microsoft is a contributor to it, or provides IP that helps build it out. And I think I've been around long enough, and you eloquently said it earlier, the extent to which the common data model is agnostic, it is not tied to a vendor, the better, because it gives greater portability and accessibility and entrepreneurship for CIOs like me to be able to say, I can slot vendors in a way that makes sense for the organization I'm serving. And again, not have to think, oh my gosh, I've got a data conversion I've got to think about because I'm moving from solution A to solution B.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that makes sense, and it feels like it's more powerful in a platform type of a solution where it's going to be easier to plug and play different systems. So yeah, it seems it's very appealing. Very appealing.
Don't you kind of wonder how much people are interested in what we're talking about right now? Like, I wonder if we have 0 people left in this fireside chat. It's just me,
this is just coffee, totally hot cocoa and coffee. So I could do this for hours.
Excellent. Excellent.
What about some of the new stuff? Because I know that just before we were hopping on the call here, there was an announcement that coincidentally, I swear, totally coincidentally, because I can barely plan my next coffee, let alone my next hour, that Microsoft have posted onto GitHub. Should we talk about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm hoping you can put it into plain English, because this is where I understand it, but I get so geeked out about it that I'm worried I'll spend the remainder of the fireside chat talking about it.
Yeah, so I think one of the interesting things that's been happening, and the thing that makes the freight train look more like a a rocket coming out of the side of the mountain, which sounds maybe not the best analogy anymore. But Microsoft announced a couple of weeks ago that it had acquired the IP, the intellectual property, for a system called Mission CRM. Mission CRM, made by a great team of folks in Canada, is really a nonprofit-focused fundraising solution that sits on top of the Microsoft Dynamics CRM or database services. So if you think of, and I'm learning all of this, so I'm warming up and learning all of this at the same time. So if you think about what's happening in the Microsoft space as there's a layer of data, and then you can tap into that data through things like Excel or even Outlook or other systems. One of the things you can do is to tap into it with Microsoft Dynamics, which is a kind of a CRM database solution. And in there, there are solutions and add-ons, much like what you're seeing in the Salesforce space with the Nonprofit Success Pack. You could do that same thing in Salesforce with the MPSP. In the Microsoft world, they now have a solution called Microsoft Fundraising and Engagement, and there are other words that I'm forgetting beyond that, that end in something with Mission CRM, which is this great team that actually built the code to begin with.
Is it kind of like NP SP in the beginning when it was purpose built around fundraising? Is it similar to that? Am I thinking about that the right way?
Yeah, and I'm racing to understand all of this as well too, because it's only been a couple of weeks, and I feel like what I'm reading is that's the case. It's really centered around fundraising. It's really centered around nonprofits not necessarily implementing this on their own. This is something that having a consultant or a technical guru or somebody who's helping you implement it is where it's going. It's free and open source, and it's definitely free and open source, because what I'm looking at on my screen here is the GitHub announcement that they just made. So they just released all the code under an MIT license, which is an open source license for anybody to grab and use for free. And it's really providing fundraising experiences around, well, anything from donor management. There's some event registration and event management built into it, payment and receipting. There's a ton built just like right under the hood. So on that freight train that seems to have been steaming out of the mountainside, on it was this jetpack, which another system was flying off, which is this fundraising and engagement. So there's been a lot happening, and yeah, I'm curious as to what the next step is going to be for the community, because if it's something that you can't really self-implement as a small organization or really as an organization on your own, then it'll be interesting to see now that they've released the code, like what the vendor community, what consultants, what open source developers will end up doing with it. But it's intriguing. Have you had a chance to learn more about it or look into it some more?
So I'm familiar with Mission CRM, but I think that what's not clear to me is where those two diverge, where Mission CRM and Microsoft, where their announcement, how much similarity there is between the product for Mission CRM and sort of the GitHub repository that allows people to get it for free. I think, I was thinking as you were talking, Ryan, I think it's a good thing in some ways that organizations can't implement fundraising engagement on their own, because I think there's been a misnomer historically that fundraising CRM is something that you can give to the intern, or it's something that you give to somebody in part of their job. And you wouldn't have you wouldn't have an intern build out your chart of accounts in your accounting package. And so I think that perhaps from Microsoft, it's a recognition. This isn't like implementing a case management solution for a couple of people who do intake. This is really about tracking revenue for your organization. This is really about tracking interactions with constituents. And this is about really building, I think what I'm trying to say is building the data and the information around relationships that oftentimes go well beyond the types of relationships that you manage in a case management solution, as an example. So I wonder to what extent it is a reflection of the complexity of the solution versus a reflection of, or a recognition that this is really requires somebody who knows and understands the product and can connect it to existing systems and connect it to a broader ecosystem of Microsoft products.
Well, I think that feels like it's the potential promise and some of the challenge. Like, again, I come at it with fresh eyes from from my seat. I've spent 15 years in the Salesforce world, a lot of time in open source, and so I'm learning more about this, and I'm very intrigued and interested from the open source perspective, because I think that there's a lot of opportunity for folks to extend and grow and to further integrate with tools like this. I wonder, as somebody who doesn't know as much about things happening in the Microsoft space, when when you go to implement something like this, like step one in creating a new user in the Salesforce world is that you can spin up a new Salesforce org, you can fire up a new set of users, you can assign them different permissions, and that's it. Would it be wrong to say that if you were trying to do that in the Microsoft world, like step one is go into Active Directory, be able to make a new user. When you do that, you're creating an inbox for somebody in Outlook, you're creating a calendar for them, you're creating access to those systems. Like, it feels like the moves are much more consequential at that very early stage. And to tell an organization like, oh, just go set this up and install and go have fun, sounds like that would be a pretty hardy task and probably a pretty scary task.
I agree, and I don't think I don't know the answer to that, and I think that this is a big open question. We at Lymphoma Research Foundation are really interested in the capabilities of some of Microsoft's new offerings, not, even before the offerings that they talked about today. But you hit on it. To use these products well, you've got to have a clean instance of Active Directory. You've got to be using Teams pretty well. You've got to think about, where are we storing files? How are we using SharePoint? It creates all kinds of CIO level discussions and explorations that I haven't had the opportunity to do yet. So this is not a real example, but if we were already heavily invested as an organization in Dropbox, and we want to move in the Microsoft direction, do we keep Dropbox?
Right.
Do we move to SharePoint? All of those things, and those aren't easy switches to make. Those aren't simple switches to make. So I think that I wonder whether you agree with this, that the underlying assumption of a lot of Microsoft offerings is that you have done a fair amount of work around defining the data that's important for you to track. And on top of that, you've done a lot of work around defining how your staff needs to engage with that data. And that perhaps the main inhibitor has been technology, but I'm guessing that for many organizations, it is technology, but it's also a lack of governance. It's a lack of process. I've gone to multiple organizations now over the course of my career. I've never gone into one and been like, oh my gosh, your Active Directory is really well cleaned up. And you know what? You totally moved to Azure Active Directory and have implemented modern security protocol. They haven't done that. And so before you begin the process, and I'm recognizing how long I've been talking about this, Ryan, but before you start any of that, my hunch is you need to start at the beginning. And that's not always the fun place to start.
Right, right. Yeah,
sorry, I realized
no.
like I might have been talking for 25 minutes.
Yeah, no, all those skiers behind you at the resort you're in, they've been standing still. I think they're asleep. They're totally just falling asleep there. No, I think you're right. I think that my passion is in the smaller organizations. I love working with smaller organizations that when you provide them tools, when you enable them with the right things, like you get to see the needle move. Like Tim Forbes on our team, he talks about this all the time. Like the idea that you get to help an organization and with your assistance, you can increase their impact. You can actually see that happen is pretty powerful. So, what I love about what's happening in the Salesforce space is the ability for organizations to potentially move quickly because they're oftentimes adding into a set of tools that they're already using. In the Microsoft space, I think that has a strong opportunity, but it almost feels like more consequential. Like these decisions like have serious consequences in the way in which you do it and how it ties into different other apps that you're using in the Microsoft space might make some of the smaller organizations feel like it's too big of a a hurdle, too big of a boulder to push to make it work best for them. But the promise of being able to integrate with a set of solutions or a data model that is open and transparent and has an opportunity to be tapped in from different programming languages and different systems, that already has a large ecosystem of its own products, like that feels really appealing. So I think that the thing that I feel in all the things I've been learning about the Microsoft fundraising and engagement tools, the thing that I'm feeling is currently missing is, who are the Soapbox Engages of the world? Who are the companies, the consultants, the people that really need to come in here and provide solutions that are going to be narrowly focused to particular verticals within our nonprofit space. And I think as you go to productize something, that becomes easier, but you don't necessarily productize an open source community. And I think that that's going to be the tightrope that I'm hoping a company like Microsoft is going to be able to walk successfully, being able to say, we really want to embrace open source. We really want to embrace the ability for a community of developers to grow and expand a base and a platform that we have, and not necessarily productize all of this open source goodness. Like, how are they going to be able to manage that? How are they going to make it so it comes down to earth for the smaller organizations? That's the challenge. Like, we are at the very early stages of this train coming out of this mountain, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity to try to figure out how that's going to work.
Yeah, you're saying a lot of opportunity in the area of sort of drawing a line in the sand where Microsoft's going to play and where they're not going to play.
Right.
And where they're going to, to the extent to which they're trying to monetize this, right? And where are they trying to monetize this?
Right. And Salesforce has taken its approach. It has an open source nonprofit success pack, and it also has a number of new paid offerings it's offering around it, next to it, on top of it, and in different capacities within its own ecosystem. So there are models like that. There are purely consultative platform infrastructure models that are out there. There's some hybrids in the middle. There's just not a lot of huge platform plays in our nonprofit space. So for me, this feels like it's a pretty big moment for us in the nonprofit tech world. And I think there's a big opportunity for this to shape the next decade. Like, my decades have been shaped by open source content management systems in the Joomla, WordPress, Drupal world. The next decade has been shaped by nonprofit CRM, cloud-based services, like what's been happening in the Salesforce world, what Blackbaud's been doing and other companies have been doing. I think we have a new era that goes far beyond just CRM and just fundraising. And my gut tells me that fundraising might just be the first offering that somebody like Tech for Social Impact over at Microsoft might be providing. Maybe.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. You brought me back to a point that, stepping back, the idea of a platform, the idea that there's now true competition in the platform space makes it really interesting for organizations that perhaps have not made significant investments in Salesforce. I really think of them as the leading platform provider. It creates a point of comparison. I think in the past, you were either sort of saying, look, we're going to move to becoming a platform-based organization. And that means certain things for us in terms of what staffing looks like, what skills we need, buy versus build, all of those types of questions. Or we're going to be like, let's just wrangle a bunch of applications and deliver business applications that are value added to individual departments and figure out the data piece in a separate layer, in a data lake or a data warehouse. Which is funny because I did a webinar on Dynamics and Salesforce, but even just in the excitement of talking about today, I'd forgotten the bigger opportunity for people listening, the nonprofits listening, is now you have a point of comparison, which even if that leads you to stay where you've made investments, at least it's another point of comparison.
And are you seeing anything in the early stages that if you're looking at different tools that are out there, the Blackbaud community, tools from the Salesforce community, now tools from the Microsoft fundraising and engagement community, Are you seeing like, okay, these are all now checking off across the board, they're all very similar, or are they different and have different strengths and weaknesses in different places? Is it just too early to tell? Like, what are you seeing so far in the Microsoft and engagement or fundraising and engagement side of things?
You know, I have more familiarity with Soapbox Engage, or sorry, more
Yes,
familiarity. I
yes.
told you I would slip it in there. I have more familiarity with Mission CRM than I do with the fundraising and engagement. What's included in Microsoft's offering? I mean, the question for me is, how well does it do head to head with Salesforce? And then by extension, to the extent that Salesforce has been more effective at matching up head to head with solutions from companies like Blackbaud, how much can you infer from that Microsoft, Salesforce, and Blackbaud's offerings have parity? But I want to go back to something I said earlier. You talked about previous decades. 15 years ago, perhaps it was correct to think about where I want to make entrepreneurial investments is around fundraising CRM, because that is really where we're going to move the needle. More and more, I think of fundraising CRM like accounting software. It is a business productivity solution, and there is tons of stuff well beyond that around service delivery, program evaluation, whatever those things are. That's where nonprofits should be entrepreneurial, not in these ostensibly back office applications that are really fundraising CRM. And I'm not talking about really cool products like Soapbox Engage. Those are entrepreneurial.
Amazing.
I'm curious. You know, that was a great segue. I'm curious. Do you know what this means yet for Soapbox Engage? I know historically you've been working with Soapbox Engage in the Salesforce ecosystem. I'm curious what your thoughts are, sort of wearing that furry hat today.
Right. Yeah. Well, what I've always thought of Soapbox Engage being is something that is solving pain points and building solutions that live somewhere between the organization's website and their database. So the website where their community is gathering, where they're engaging for online fundraising, online advocacy, online event registration, anything that's online, and their database, like that last mile there is a challenge for most organizations. Getting it right, putting the data in the right place, that's difficult. And we've been lucky enough to have, since the very early days, be able to have a system like Salesforce that we've been able to connect to via their great API services to make that something that is just not an issue for organizations. And it's been great to be able to provide a service like that for organizations. What I think the promise is on the Microsoft side is the ability for somebody to come from a Soapbox Engage donations app page and to make a donation and then have an alert sent to somebody's Microsoft Teams instance that is in a specific channel just for major gift, the fundraising team. And while it's doing that, have the data go directly into Microsoft Dynamics or the Common Data Service, following all the structure of the Common Data Model, that somebody in the fundraising team can then go ahead and have an easy mail merge come out of Microsoft Word, and then somebody else in the fundraising team can look at the dollars and cents of it through something like an Excel spreadsheet. That opportunity of weaving that full story together is really interesting. And for a company like ours, whose focus has been on how do we just make it easier for organizations to be able to grab that great prospect, that great donor, that great supporter, and help them make it easier to contribute and support their organization, and then instantly give access to everybody in the organization through different types of tools that are purpose-built to do specific things to that data immediately, that just seems pretty awesome. And I do agree. I think that we all can spend a lot of time rebuilding all different types of infrastructure that great companies before us have done for now 30 years. I feel like a lot of people are saying, how do we get from point A to point B? I'm saying like, how do we go somewhere else? How do we jettison into an entirely different arena? And I think thinking broadly like what you could do in these larger platforms, that sounds really appealing. And a company like ours can be a small business that can see the fundraising all the way through the first touch of an online donor, all the way through to the other end, and not necessarily need to rebuild everything to begin with.
I mean, as I was listening to you talk, one of the things a light bulb went off for me that, every morning when I go to my desk and wake my computer from sleep, Teams is already up. It's been up. Outlook is up. Excel is up. All of these things are already up. And the truth is that the more that those can get integrated, what am I trying to say? The more that those interactions, to the extent that they layer into a CRM solution, and there is not doing something in one place and replicating it in the other, or relying on a vendor to build an integration between the two, I think that goes back to one of the early points I made. Microsoft already has, I think they say 300,000 customers. It's in the form of Excel users and Outlook users and probably even more Teams users now. So it's interesting when you talk about Soapbox Engage and this layer where you're interacting with Teams perhaps rather than Soapbox Engage, what that might mean.
Yeah, I wonder myself. I know that, for instance, we've already built a Teams integration where when somebody today is using Soapbox Engage and a donation comes in, alerts can be scheduled and sent immediately into different Teams channels and different teams.
A team of a team.
A team of a team and a channel.
Right.
Connecting to a bot. It feels like there's that there's a lot of opportunity there for us to then be able to say, well, what's the next thing? Because we've been focusing so long on that first layer of helping that donation come in. Like, what's going to happen after that? What's the follow-up? How can a company like ours help organizations go deeper? And to slightly segue, the thing that I would say for folks that are developers or ISVs or just partners in the call, I think the thing that I'm interested in seeing how Microsoft approaches kind of the letting 1,000 flowers bloom. Like, is the long-term approach for Microsoft going to say, let's build more things internally, or let's buy things and add it into the Microsoft space, put the Microsoft label on it, and away we go? Or is it truly going to be, we're laying down infrastructure, we want everybody to build things, and we're not going to try to compete against our own community? I think that's going to really set in motion the direction in which this community would rally around building things. I know that some companies have been burned in different communities. You see it in all different types of ecosystems that are out there that are proprietary, where the proprietary company says, hey, actually, this is something that all of our organizations need, all of our customers need. We're going to build this ourselves. We're going to buy this now. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. Is fundraising and engagement the first of many types of acquisitions or purchases? I don't know. Is it something that is not the norm and is just kind of like setting a flag and away we go to develop and build? I don't know, but I think it'll be very interesting to see after this what Microsoft's going to do, because that's what's going to help them gain developers and interest of people that want to build in their ecosystem.
I think maybe this can help bring together something we were talking about earlier. You were talking about Teams. There's a nonprofit here in Philadelphia. It's an arts and cultural institution, and they really want notifications when certain members come on site to their organization. And so if you're thinking about Microsoft and you're like, well, the natural place to do that is through Teams, and the natural way to do that is to the development team, but it's not the whole development team, it's really the major gift officers. All of a sudden, for folks on the call who thought earlier, what in the world is that guy Kyle talking about with Active Directory? How Active Directory and Teams are structured have implications for how a tool like Soapbox Engage or another tool that just simply provide notification works. And I think if you were talking about Salesforce, you would build that. If you were doing that in Salesforce, you'd build that in Salesforce, and it might be at the outset easier to do, a lower burden of development, a lower barriers to entry to develop that. You're defining groups in Salesforce that are independent of your Active Directory, or independent of Teams. I think the geeky part of me says, why would you want to do that? The practical part of me says, we need some time to see whether that practically works, and whether the integration between how your organization organizes writ large helps inform how your applications that range from citizen apps that are built all the way up to enterprise apps to how those engage with the broader Microsoft ecosystem.
Yeah. I'm looking at the time. I know we probably need to wrap up, or at least ask for some questions here if folks have questions. So if you have any questions, that'd be awesome to be able to answer them or engage with you guys. I do think that one of the things I've been lucky enough to do is to have been part of open source ecosystems like the Joomla ecosystem, like the Salesforce nonprofit success pack community, and to be heavily involved in that. And I know from my perspective, I get a lot of energy from that. And I think what's happening in what I'm seeing in the Microsoft world has the potential for that. But to be candid, where it is right now is very different from where the Salesforce kind of open source community or the MPSP community is. So we're going to need to see how that grows and changes over time. I know for me, I'm going to continue to be heavily involved in the Salesforce community, especially specifically in helping nonprofit organizations make the most of these tools. Big giant corporations providing these tools at free or low cost and adding on to that open source value. Fantastic. We need all of that. That's great. And what we need is passionate folks that are willing to say, how can we make sense of this? How can we innovate with this? How can we help organizations really move that needle that Tim talks about? How do we make that happen? So I'm excited to see where that might happen. I think it's very, very, very early stages in the Microsoft kind of fundraising engagement world, of course, but Microsoft in general from TSI as well too. It'll be interesting to see where they go with that.
So if there was somebody on the call who has experience in Joomla or has experience in the Salesforce ecosystem, and they said, okay, Ryan, where do I start? What would you say to them? Where would you tell them to start?
Right, get Microsoft for Dummies, and it's a really, really big book. It's a huge, huge book. No, that's a good question. A lot of the stuff that's coming out is stuff that I'm literally looking at a tab right now that I just saw couple of hours ago from the GitHub repository. So on GitHub, there is a new project called Fundraising and Engagement from the Microsoft repositories. So that's interesting to see for the developers. I know that Microsoft has a landing page right now over at Tech for Social Impact. If you do a Google search, let's just add every corporation in here. If you do
Bing.
a Google search,
shouldn't you do a Bing search?
If you do a Bing search by asking Siri how to talk to Einstein in cloud Salesforce, yeah. If you go to your favorite search engine and you do a search for Microsoft fundraising and engagement, they do have some early documentation there. It's very, very, very early. It's very limited. They do have a little video there to let you learn more. So I'm hoping that more is going to be out there because it's pretty darn new. And for folks that are developer inclined, that are looking to get more involved, that are wondering like, okay, let me see this open sourceness, I can make sure that we include a link here as well to the new GitHub repository that they have. In fact, I will just add it into the chat room here if that's possible, if I know how to do that.
You should be able to. There you go.
There we go. Yeah, because I think that there's a lot of there's a lot in there. This is not something that was just built overnight on that steaming locomotive. This is something that the Mission CRM folks have been building for many years. So there's a lot to unpack there. It'll be interesting to see how the community rallies around that.
Yep. What do you hope? I know I'm putting you on the spot and making you answer most of the questions and just getting to react to your really good ideas, which is my perfect idea of a fireside chat. What would you like to see? You know, you've talked a lot about this notion of community. What would you like to see in 12 months in the Microsoft community? What would you say this has been successful over the last 12 months? Knowing that to the extent that there's a Blackbaud community and that there's a Salesforce community, what would success look like in 12 months?
Yeah, I think step one for me is I want to see a community grow around the common data model. And that isn't necessarily Microsoft specific. I think it's a big opportunity for organizations to say, we don't want to debate our data models anymore. We really want all of these vendors, all of these companies to rally around a common data model. I feel like that's what our broader nonprofit community needs. So if there were a community growing around that from an open source perspective, that'd be fantastic to see. in the Microsoft space specifically, it'll be interesting to see how a developer community grows around extending what's happening in the CDM and in the Microsoft Dynamics space. So the folks over at Threshold World have been doing a lot of work around this, building solutions on top of the common data model and looking to expand there over time. So it'll be interesting to see what folks like that have to deliver to the community. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for the, the citizen developers as well as the folks that are developer inclined that want to take advantage of a new cloud ecosystem to do that. And I think that's going to take the form of nonprofits coming together and saying, this is what we need, this is what we want, and not necessarily needing that to just come from the companies. And I don't see that in any of these spaces. I see a lot of momentum and energy coming from the nonprofits in the different ecosystems that are out there. But for Microsoft to be successful as one of the latest entrants in this, I think I would like to see, and they'll need to see a bit of interest coming in from saying the average individuals at organizations saying, let's come together and build specific solutions for our community. That's what I'm thinking. What are you thinking?
Again, you have more experience than me, but a light bulb that went off in the last I ignored most of what you said, but in the last 5 seconds, I really, something you said resonated for me, that the power of the common data model in some ways is that the Lymphoma Research Foundation, we want to build a mobile app, right? And we're probably not going to build that on proprietary Microsoft or Salesforce or Blackboard technology. We're going to go to a mobile app developer. But to future-proof us, the common data model is sort of a roadmap for how to structure the data and to say, look, this mobile app is likely going to have functionality that isn't captured by the common data model, but let's not reinvent the wheel around how we're structuring a new email, a new login request. Like, this is my little small brain, the way that I conceptualize it, but this is what we're going to call first name. This is the name of the first name field.
Right. I'm thinking back to when I was involved in the early Salesforce nonprofit community sprints. I just wanted an excuse on a cold winter day to get people in DC to come together and to geek out and have some pizza, maybe have some drinks, and talk about what could we be doing on our own rather than needing to wait for somebody. What if we just built it on our own? I think one of the benefits of community and a technology like Salesforce was, well, that wasn't actually terribly difficult for us to like get moving on that because those things were accessible to us. And I think the question is going to be how flexible can these solutions be over time? Like if you guys are out there building your own mobile app and it's not any particular platform, well, there's more scaffolding, there's more startup costs potentially to that. So from an open source community perspective, where I'm thinking, how do we build once and reuse everywhere? Like, how do we make sure that a small humane society in Kansas is able to use an app or a system and just know that it's just going to work and that they don't need to be locked into one ecosystem, or they don't need to be locked into one vendor that's the only company that can provide that to them? And maybe we're going to be in a world where if there's a common data model that many different platforms agree with, and if it's easy for you to hook into those, maybe we actually see a lot more freedom and organizations using different platforms on purpose-driven needs. I don't know. It just feels like we've got a lot of promise ahead of us for the nonprofit tech world.
I agree. I think here at Build, just internally, we feel like we're holding something in our hands. We don't know quite what it is yet, but that there's a lot of power. There's a lot of inherent power in not only what Microsoft is doing that really is product oriented, but what they're doing on more of the social impact side and saying, we don't need to own this. We can steward it and we can invest in it, which is the way, I don't know if those are the words they talk about things like the common data model, but I know we're really excited. And you pointed out that we're running out of time. I think that our fireside chat was so informative. We have no open questions. So I don't know. I don't know if we've just had a massive drop off and it's just you and I chatting now at this point. But I'd like to thank everyone from for joining us today. Ryan, especially you, thank you for making time. I know you're really busy inflating penguins and yeah, demonstrative of what you've got going on. I'm hoping, Ryan, maybe you and I can have another fireside chat when it's actually truly cold, and maybe we can reconvene, see what we've learned in the last 3 months, see what still is sticking against the wall and what's not. But thank you again for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. And we've got a couple of resources up there if you use your favorite search engine to look for Microsoft fundraising and engagement. I know we've got a couple of different resources of things that we've been learning, nerding about, sharing internally. So please feel free to take a look at those. And yeah, it'll be exciting to see what happens. And I hope the next time we can do this at that ski resort. That looks amazing. I want to be there.
I want to be there too. I feel like you could socially distance at a ski resort right now.
Yeah, right. The helmet, the distance. We can make it happen.
Yeah, I'm going to chat at everybody. One of the resources that Ryan was referencing after the webinar will include, we're going to send out a link to the recording and Ryan gave me a couple of references ahead of time. But before people jump off, I'll chat at you the resource from Soapbox Engage that he was referencing earlier. And if I can, Ryan, keep talking so that I can have cover.
Coordinate different things together.
Yeah.
And I think it'll be interesting to see over the course of just the next couple of weeks, just what's going to be the initial nonprofit community interest in what Microsoft is delivering, what it is, what it isn't, how difficult it's going to be for organizations to be able to use and run with. It feels like it's very, very, very early days. So we got this webinar and this chat out just in time, but I have a feeling when we talk in just a couple of months, the whole world will be upside down. Who knows what will be happening, but maybe we'll still be able to talk about technology, and that'd be fun too, Kyle.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again for joining, everyone. Ryan, great to see you. Hope you didn't get too hot in your hat and the fire behind you, and have a great day, everyone.